Welcome to the last session of our Democracy Speaker Series for 2025. I'm Linda Warner. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm part of the ESD leadership team. I see a lot of new faces, so before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to briefly introduce Elders for Sound Democracy, which is a project of Elders Action Network formed in the spring of 2020. We are elders who are active and often retired professionals from around the country. ESD's purpose is to protect and strengthen democracy now and for future generations. Our priorities are to support democratic rights and freedoms and to promote fair voting and civic engagement. Through our community meetings, newsletters, and action teams, we provide education on democracy issues and opportunities to come together with like-minded elders in the community. We seek partnerships with effective organizations that share our values to engage in nonpartisan activism. Because we are a 501c3, we do not get involved in supporting candidates, but we do advocate for issues that support our democratic values. We are building and expanding state chapters in California, Washington, Wisconsin, and hope for more. Through those state chapters, we encourage participation in democracy at local and state levels. We have action teams for countering political corruption and disinformation, defending democracy, and promoting fair voting and civic engagement. And we're gearing up, not giving up. And based on the interest and turnout for today, I don't think that Joyce needs much of an introduction. Most of you are familiar with her through her Substack, Civil Discourse, her appearances on MSNBC, where she's a legal analyst. And you can find more about her bio in the back of the book cover. So we look forward to Joyce to explain the legal issues of our day and to put them in context and perspective. As a former, like many decades ago, history and civics teacher, I appreciate her straightforward and informative postings. I rarely miss her posts. Joyce seems to make sense to many of us. So today we want to talk about her new book, Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy, which is just what we were looking for. And we want to focus on her message and what that means for us. I will ask Joyce questions, and while you're listening, if you have questions you'd like to ask of her, please put them in the chat and we'll cover them in the Q&A following. Joyce joins us from California today in the second week of her first book tour, and we really appreciate her taking the time out of what she's doing right now to be here today. So welcome, Joyce, and thank you for being here. So I'm just going to start with what inspired you to write the book and how did you approach it?
I'm sure that y'all remember the same moment that I do. This moment after the election, Kamala Harris has lost. The country is, or at least parts of the country that I interact with, were utterly devastated by the prospect of having another go-round of Donald Trump in the White House. And what worried me in that moment was so many people who I spoke with who were ready to give up. People who said, I worked hard on this election. I did everything I could have possibly done. I was all in. And now I'm just over. There's nothing else I can do. I'm just going to have to walk away. That seemed to me to be such a dangerous, albeit understandable sentiment in that moment. The idea that we would just remove ourselves from the political amphitheater and leave it wide open for Donald Trump to implement Project 2025. We all knew what was coming. He had written about it in detail. Maybe he is a little bit overstating it, but his people. his folks that he would put in office and that he had in office before had laid out this very detailed plan for what was coming. The idea that we would just walk away and let him do that seemed to me to be an unaffordable toll on democracy. And so I thought, well, maybe I can write and talk with people about why we shouldn't give up, and more importantly, help people understand, based on our governmental system and our 250-year sweep of history, not just this difficult moment that we're living in, but the progress that we've made over time despite our flaws. Maybe I can convince folks that we absolutely must not give up. So that was the impetus behind the book.
Thank you. Thank you. As I was reading it at the end of of chapter 2, where you've laid out the precarious position we're in, and you said we need to focus on our institutions, our powers, and we need to practice our democracy. And as citizens, we should focus on promoting the vote and voting. Can you tell us why you're so optimistic?
So Linda, you're the right person to have this conversation with, as someone who has taught civics in the past. It's incredibly easy to focus on our weaknesses. It's all we see in the news these days. What we don't do enough is focus on our strengths. And that means we need to understand sort of the basics of a good civics class. The reason the founding fathers decided upon this three-branch of government system with checks and balances, which was their reaction, their rejection of living under the thumb of a king. They wanted to make sure that no one in our society could become so powerful that the people would be subjected to the will of others. And so they saw this system of checks and balances as the best way to get there. That means we have foundational institutions. We have the executive branch, the presidency, the Congress, the legislative branch, the courts, the judicial branch. But we also have a free press. We have other institutions like the military. And I think in some ways, the most underrated institution is us, is the people. As the founding fathers knew, all of the power that government holds comes from us. We grant it to government because we understand that by doing that, we can have better lives. If there are systems that order our universe, and a rule of law that dictates behavior so that we're not subject to the whims of kings, then we are better off, and that's the price that we pay for ceding some of our power. So I think by focusing on the institutions and understanding that the institutions are sometimes manned by people who are not worthy of them. We're seeing that across the board right now. People who simply don't uphold their oaths of office. That's not a reflection on the institutions necessarily. It's a reflection on the people who are in them, the people who have put them in place. And so it's instructive for us to understand that we can restore or refocus on the institutions to rebuild them and go back to that vision that the founding fathers had of a balanced government. It's sort of a vote the bums out of office moment, I think.
I see in another chapter where you're saying that protecting voting rights is the most critical thing that we can do. And that's pretty scary. What can we do to start that? What's our
So
role?
I'm an old school voting rights lawyer. I worked on voting rights cases when I was in government at the Justice Department for 25 years. I work on voting rights cases out of government. And it all comes down to protecting the right to vote, because voting is the right that unlocks all of our other rights. The instinct that I think has to animate how we pursue this work in this moment is this: if your right to vote was not so powerful, if it wasn't so important, people would not be working so hard to take it away from you. Right? I mean, that's the instinct. They understand that when we vote, we are powerful. When our votes can be counted, we're powerful. So protecting the right to vote requires that we think about everything that goes into voting and having your vote counted. You have to be able to register to vote. You have to be able to stay registered. You have to actually be able to vote, and you have to make sure that your vote gets counted. And because we run 50 state elections, not one national one, there's a role that we can all play in picking a part of the voting cycle that we think is interesting or important and working on that. And let me give you some examples. There are challenges underway against our right to register to vote. Many of you all will have heard about the SAVE Act, which did not pass out of Congress because there was so much public opposition to it. Don't ever let anyone tell you that our voices don't count. It was American citizens calling their Republican senators and congressmen that prevented the SAVE Act from becoming law. And the SAVE Act, in essence, would require us to prove citizenship in order to be able to register to vote. That's a poll tax. I mean, I'm a Southerner. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. I know a poll tax when I see one. In order to prove citizenship, the easiest way to do that is with a passport. There are a couple of other forms of ID that will work. But the barrier to getting a passport is it's too costly for many people. And no one should have to pay that poll tax to exercise their right to vote. So it's great that the SAVE Act failed. There was also an effort by Donald Trump to implement that requirement using an executive order. That's been blocked in the courts. There will be more coming on that. And for those of you who read my newsletter, Civil Discourse, you're probably familiar with a move on at the Election Assistance Commission, which is a bipartisan group, part of the executive branch, where they're trying to bootstrap that requirement in place. That'll impact people with limited means. It'll impact students who may just not have access to the ID that they need to get that proof of citizenship if they're away from home at school. It will impact married women, by the way. Depending on how your names line up on different forms of identification, married women may be forced out of the voting population if this were to go into effect. And look, Trump's folks are serious about this one. We can't assume that just because it's dormant right now, it won't have a resurgence. So it's important for everybody to be aware and talk with your friends about this. If you don't have a passport and you're able to, you might want to get one. In our communities, we need to start thinking about how we will get identification for people who may not have documents readily at hand, may not be able to afford to get a passport. That might be forcing your Secretary of State to issue state IDs that will qualify. We're all going to have to innovate in this area. And that's just registration. We'll still have day of election issues. Involving these moves that are in Maine on the ballot right now is an initiative that would do away with absentee voting. It would make Maine just like Alabama, where we have only one day to vote. And let me tell you, that's tough. That imposes real burdens on, for instance, single working parents or folks who just have responsibilities on that one designated day that they can't avoid. So lots of issues there. And then, of course, we'll have to work on having votes counted. And that means that if you're interested, volunteer now to be a poll worker or a poll watcher or to participate in your county or your state's vote count. Training is underway. Volunteers are critical. That's how we run our elections. There are a lot of places to get involved. Your state chapter of the League of Women Voters is a great place for you to start if you're not sure where you'd like to intersect. And I'm a huge fan of these initiatives where voters in blue states are writing postcards to voters in purple and red states, encouraging them to go out and vote. There's data that suggests that that personal touch is incredibly important. So lots of different ways we can all work on this.
Well, I could tell you that in the last 3 election cycles, we recruited hundreds of volunteers who wrote thousands of letters and postcards to get out the vote. And we do send out action alerts if there's a piece of legislation that's important that we send to our members too. So the SAVE Act is something very scary, and I wish it would go away. But we seem to have an issue that I wasn't expecting, and that was our new gerrymandering crisis. that, of course, affected Texas, California, New Jersey, Virginia, and just recently, Indiana has called a session to redistrict. So give us your thoughts about the legal issues and challenges of gerrymandering.
You know, gerrymandering is a terrible travesty because at its essence, it's an effort to make sure that certain people's votes don't count in certain kinds of elections. But don't overstate what gerrymandering is. It will impact congressional elections, primarily in the form of the House of Representatives, because gerrymandering changes the maps that are used to draw districts in states. And that's a problem, right? That's why Congress, for instance, or why the House gets so locked in and makes it difficult for candidates from opposition parties to win. But it doesn't impact presidential elections. It doesn't impact Senate elections. It doesn't impact your state leadership elections, although it may impact in-district elections in states. So make sure that you understand what it is and what it isn't. There is a dangerous narrative circulating from people who want to try to convince you that you should just relinquish your right to vote without a fight, right? They want you to stay home and not participate because you think your vote doesn't matter. And that's just not the case. Your vote still matters in all of these statewide elections, in municipal elections, in county elections. And let me tell you something. Gerrymandering has become such a cause celeb that I think we may be approaching a moment where Americans will come together to find strategies that allow them to defeat gerrymandering. Here's an example. If more young people vote, we can change outcomes in even some of these heavily gerrymandered districts. So if you are deeply concerned about gerrymandering, the response shouldn't be to give up. It should be to think strategically about how more people can be convinced to vote. You know, voting numbers in this country are tragically low, particularly the 18 to 29-year-old age bracket has an impact. Many of them were convinced to stay home and not vote in 2024 with just this kind of rhetoric. Your vote doesn't count. Why should you bother? It's too much trouble to do it. So this is an important place where we can all push back. You know, the Supreme Court's decisions on gerrymandering have been reprehensible in my view. I think that it will get worse, but it's not ball game.
What are some other legal developments or voter suppression legislation that we might be seeing soon? What do we need to look out for?
So legal analysts are waiting for the Supreme Court's decision in a case out of Louisiana. And it's an unusual case because the Supreme Court had it briefed and heard oral argument last term. And as we were all waiting for a decision at the end of the court's term of court, the court said, we're going to hold this one over. We're going to hear it again next year because we have a question. And the question, it turns out, is whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is constitutional. Many of y'all will remember the Shelby County versus Holder case that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act during the Obama administration. Let me do Law School 101 if y'all will indulge me and talk just for a second about the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 provided for what's called preclearance. That meant that lawyers like me could challenge anti-voting provisions before they went into effect. In other words, when we won, we could keep the bad things from happening before they ever impacted voters. It was incredibly powerful. We used it across the board in lots of different situations. Losing Section 5 was devastating. And the court's reasoning, the Chief Justice wrote that this view that race impacted voting and that measures were being taken in an effort to keep Black people from voting were outmoded, and the data no longer was up to date. And so the way that they killed preclearance was by saying that the criteria that the Voting Rights Act used for determining which states or regions in the United States had voting issues that should require them to submit new measures for preclearance was outdated. And the court seemed to invite Congress to submit updated data so that the Voting Rights Act would continue in force. But Republicans, for the first time since the Voting Rights Act had been passed, refused to come to the table and re-up it. The act required that every set number of years Congress repass the act. And that had happened routinely since its passage in the early 1960s, exclusively under Republican administrations. I mean, this was bipartisanship at work. And the rhetoric that you heard from people on both sides of the aisle and from Republican presidents talked about how essential and important voting was, and everyone came together to get it done. Until the Supreme Court said in Shelby County versus Holder, no more preclearance, and Republicans in Congress were happy to jump on board. That's Section 5. One of the things that John Roberts said in his majority opinion in Shelby County versus Holder was, but there's still Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Y'all can travel under that. Section 2 was used primarily to attack gerrymandering, and the distinction between it and Section 5 is that Section 2 is for challenging measures that are anti-voting after they go into effect. You have to let the bad thing happen before you can challenge it in court. So not nearly as elegant of a mechanism as Section 5 and preclearance was. But lawyers are nimble, and the civil rights groups and others who litigate in this area began to focus on using Section 2 to challenge gerrymandering, but also other measures that were designed to tamp down on people's ability to vote. And now here, that catches us up to this term. That's the end of Law School 101. Sorry about that for those of you for whom that was too much detail. But I think it's important to understand that preclearance was this sort of proactive measure. And now we're in a world where we can only challenge stuff once voters start having their rights denied. It looks like the Supreme Court is preparing to undercut even that. I don't think that they'll flat out declare that Section 2 is unconstitutional when they decide Calais. That would be, I think this court is frankly politically aware, and they understand that this close to the midterm elections, doing that would cause public backlash that might even bring out more people to the polls. So I think we'll see something like Section 5, where they say criteria are out of date, or they'll just make it much more difficult. The requirements for bringing a Section 2 case will be enhanced, but they'll essentially gut that just like they gutted Section 5. And of course, the fix is Congress. Congress can rewrite the statute, can put it back in place, can go around the court's objections with new legislation. This has to be a #1 priority for the Democratic Party. If you believe that the midterm elections are important, and I do, then you should try to vote for people who are not capital D Democrats, but who are democracy oriented, small d democracy oriented, whatever party they belong to, so that we can have a Congress that will again understand that voting is important. Who you vote for is a political choice. Your ability to vote is a fundamental American right, and we need a Congress that believes that too.
Which organizations do you think, do you have an opinion about this, are most effective in promoting and protecting voting for democracy?
Yeah, this is a great question. We are so lucky because there are so many of them. I'm a huge fan of the bipartisan work done by the League of Women Voters, which of course includes many men as well. There are civil rights groups that for decades have been committed litigators, but have also worked on issues like restoring the rights of people with old felony convictions to vote, or making sure that people who are new in communities know how to register and where to vote. So the Legal Defense Fund is one of those groups. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is another. There's MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. There's a full range of civil rights groups that participate in this work and that are just utterly magnificent. These are the people who frequently will man the 1-800 numbers as we go into elections and make sure that they are in real time monitoring voter suppression, and communicating with local officials to get it fixed so people can vote. I'm an enormous fan of Mark Elias, who left the private practice of law to push voting rights work with just diligence and vigor and intelligence that's so remarkable. And of course, Mark, who runs the Democracy Docket, writes a newsletter that focuses on the cases that he's bringing. I think he's got 60 plus active cases right now, which tells you a lot about the challenges we face. He's an extraordinarily skillful litigator and someone who it makes a lot of sense to follow. And I could go on. There are other folks who are now litigating these cases. If there is a silver lining to the Trump administration, it's the fact that people have pulled together who historically were very worried about protecting their own territory and their own real estate. And now folks are meeting, they're communicating, they're working on these issues, and they're coordinating with blue state attorneys general who are increasingly bringing litigation of their own. So in the Shelby County versus Holder case, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the dissent. And she chastised the Chief Justice, saying that doing away with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was like taking down your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you hadn't gotten wet yet. Those are very powerful words, and the image, I think, is accurate. Now what we're seeing the civil rights group doing is that they're trying to put the umbrella back up to make sure that we're protected.
Now, what are some other things, big and small, that we can do when it comes to voter protection?
Yeah, so look, maybe the most important thing we can do, and it's a story I tell in my book that I learned from a young voting rights activist in Texas. It's personal engagement. You know how you don't want to go to a party if you don't have an invitation or a friend to go to the party with sometimes? Voting can be a lot like that. And I think my view is formed by the fact that my mom, a single mom in California, a preschool teacher, never missed an election, always talked with me about the candidates as she was doing her research, took me to forums with her, took me with her to vote on the way to school. And so voting to me seemed like something that you did, right? It was just, there wasn't a question that you wouldn't vote. My husband comes from a very similar family. His dad, back when Alabama was an all-Democratic state, my father-in-law ran the Democratic Party in Alabama. And so my husband, same deal. And so for our kids, election days were like holidays, right? We would take them out for a really good breakfast, and then they would go vote with us, and we would drop them off at school. Everybody would watch the returns together at night on TV. I mean, it was the only time I would let the kids eat in the living room. So it had very much that holiday flavor in our house. That's obviously not true for everyone. And those of us who've been fortunate enough to have that kind of upbringing or to grow into that as adults can extend that same grace to friends and relatives. So every election cycle, I try to adopt a few first-time voters, usually some of my friends' kids, and help them make sure that they're registered, make sure that they know where their vote. That can be a hang-up, right? For a lot of people, especially if your polling place changes at the last minute, knowing how to do all that and having a mentor is a big deal. You can gather an online circle of friends, or you can host brunch at your house on election day. And make sure you're the encouragement that people need to get out and vote. In Alabama at the churches, they call it souls to the polls, which I just love. The idea of gathering in community and educating yourself about the candidates and then voting. It's all really powerful. The last thing that I want to mention in this regard is this. It has become a popular tactic in some states under the rhetoric of keeping voter rolls up to date and accurate to prune people from the rolls, to remove people from the rolls of active voters, which forces you to jump through a lot of extra hoops to make sure that your vote gets counted. So some of you may have encountered this phenomenon. My next door neighbor, a wonderful guy who just so happens to be the leading voting rights lawyer in Alabama, has had a finger in every case for decades. He's now in his 80s and is just a remarkable lawyer. Goes to vote, now I'm going to forget which year, I think it's 2018 in the midterm elections, and is told he's no longer an active voter. even as knowledgeable as Jim is, it took him a while to track that down and get it fixed so his vote would count, but he could do it. He had the time, he had the skills, he had the opportunity. We need to be proactive about this. You cannot be removed from the rolls of active voters closer than 90 days to an election. So when we get down to day 89 or day 88, ahead of every election, check that you're registered. You can go to any one of these online sites that allow you to track your voter registration. And when it shows that you're an active voter, take a screenshot and make sure you print that out and have it handy with you when you go to vote, so that if someone tells you that you're not an active voter, you've got the proof that yes, you are, and you can't have been removed from the active rolls. You know, you can still vote if you've been made inactive, but you do have to vote this provisional ballot and then go back with identification, often to a centralized office, not to your polling place. It just adds so many more hoops to the exercise of a right. Our rights should not be hindered in this way. And increasingly, the fight that we're having is the fight to devote to vote despite these barriers people are setting up.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you have anything more to say about the challenges we face motivating and engaging young people to vote?
Yeah, I don't know about y'all. So we've got 4 kids. Our oldest is, I have 4, so I forget their ages. He's 36. Our baby is 22. And I write about our baby in the book because he's a smart kid and a good kid and a very liberal kid. And he's deeply disenchanted with the political system. He's young enough that the first presidency that he really sort of paid attention to and studied through adult eyes was Donald Trump's first presidency. And I write in the book that when I asked him, why aren't you and your friends out protesting? Can we go out and protest together? He looked at me and he said, Mom, protests don't work. I was 4 years old when Occupy happened, and nothing has changed. We still have wealthy politicians and caucuses that control everything in this country. It's not a true democracy. And I was forced to have that painful confrontation that he doesn't have that same innate love and need and admiration of democracy that people in my generation have. He does not have that same understanding of not just the potential of democracy, right? Because nobody pretends that we're perfect. We are aspirational. This country was founded with the original sin of slavery, something that we've never fully reckoned with. Many people have been excluded from the promise of democracy, but my view has always been that we expand democracy, like we did during the civil rights movement, when instead of rejecting the country, Martin Luther King explicitly said to his folks, democracy, it's a check that hasn't been paid yet, but we should work to make sure that that happens, that we're able to achieve its benefits, because Dr. King understood that in this governmental framework, we could always work to have more opportunity, to make our lives better. If you care about climate change, democracy is way better than a dictatorship for moving those goals forward. And so communicating that to young people, I think, is the key. We have to have conversations with them. My child is a work in progress, where we say to them, what do you think your life will look like if Donald Trump becomes a dictator? And for instance, those wealthy interests that you're concerned about are given free range. There's no potential check and balance on them. It's not a binary choice between good and evil. It's a question of what form of government serves us best. And like Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other form that's been tried.
Speaking of protesting, is it effective?
Everyone will have to make their own judgment. I'll share mine. Seeing 7 to 8 million Americans out protesting on No King's Day was really the shot in the arm that I needed. One of the most dangerous things that's happening to us in this moment is the feeling that you're alone. And I'm sure you've all had that at times. You know, you're trying to interact with folks, maybe close friends who you've known for years. And yeah, they think Trump is bad. They don't like what this administration is doing, but they're pretty insulated from it. And they think that they can just sort of sit this one out, turn a blind eye, because, you know, I've heard so many people say, oh, it's just too painful. I just can't look anymore. I can't pay attention. Um, or people who just believe that they personally won't be impacted and maybe they just don't care about what's happening to other folks. All of that is enormously painful. And it really is intentional. I mean, this is an administration that thrives, as do many would-be dictators, on making us feel overwhelmed. And like Trump's success is inevitable, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So to me, when I see 8 million of my fellow citizens out marching, I am inspired, and I believe that I'm not alone. And the lesson that I've learned from interacting with people who were foot soldiers in the civil rights movement. It's just horrible that we're losing so many more of them every year because this is the wisdom that's foundational for me. The knowledge that you should never worry about a big problem alone, right? You should always worry about a problem like the existential crisis our democracy is facing in community, because that's where your inspiration and your support will come from. And you don't have to be the person who fights the fight every day and succeeds all on your own. You're part of this group. You know, if 8 million Americans marched, I'm sure it's 4 or 5 times that many that are now thoroughly outraged. And if we each just do whatever little piece is in front of you, you might decide to go be a poll worker. You might decide to work on a community forum on voting. You might decide that your best usage is writing a song that people can sing about democracy. There's a lot of different ways that we can do this. But if we are all doing it as part of a larger community, that I think is something that tells us that we can succeed and that we will succeed, just like we blocked the SAVE Act from passage in Congress when it came up and looked like it was really about to go through. When we all work together, we succeed. Protests are part of exercising our democratic muscle and getting us ready to do whatever we need to do in 2026 to make sure that we can protect our elections, to make sure that they're free and fair, and that our votes count.
Thank you. Thank you. I think got time for maybe one more question before we open it up and look at what's in the chat and get more questions. Can you talk about the importance and impact of engaging in issues and elections at the local level?
Trying to think who it was that said this. I know exactly who it was. The mayor of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, was at the time a young Democrat. Now he's been in office for a number of years. Um, Walt said to me at one point when we were talking about his first run to be mayor, that mayors were incredibly important because they determined whether your trash got picked up or not. And that he was being glib a little bit, but it really is in many ways a marker for the importance of local government. Your day-to-day life is influenced in many ways more deeply by who your mayor is and who's on your city council than it is by the president of the United States. And so it's democracy at the local level that's foundational for building good lives and making sure that we can all have the joy that we want to claim in our own lives. And our votes really do impact those races. Much smaller voting pools, and a very low number of ballots can impact the outcome of those elections. My good friend, my podcast co-host, Barb McQuaid, likes to tell the story about a local election where she and her husband were out raking leaves, and a guy who they weren't going to vote for, I think for city council, came walking through, shaking hands, talking to people, and they spent some time talking to him, and they both ended up voting for him, and he won by one vote. Maybe that was their vote, maybe it wasn't, but I love when Barb tells that story because it reminds me that our ability to vote is unbelievably powerful, particularly at the local level where it really matters a whole lot. And you know, something else that we should think about, we see this happening here in California, in Illinois, in other states where governors are stepping up to say, not in my state federal government, we're not going to deal with your kleptocracy, with your disregard for the rule of law and the Constitution. And so these state leaders are becoming powerful forces for democracy. That's one of the values of federalism. Republicans for years have talked about states' rights and how important they are. And it's ironic that we're seeing Democratic governors and attorneys general being the ones to stand up for states' rights. That can also happen at the local levels, where mayors, when we vote for them and tell them what our values are and what we expect them to do, they too can play a role in standing up for the rule of law and democracy. And so we can strengthen democracy at the state and local levels, even while we're watching problems happen at the federal level. Strengthening those other levels of democracy just ensures that it's more baked into the system and makes it much harder to defeat. We're seeing that happen with the National Guard issues, where there are states and localities that are going to court, asking the courts to force the White House to engage only in legal mobilizations of the National Guard. So I think now more than ever, these local elections have and deserve prominence. And who we elect, we should be scrutinizing these choices. And it's not, too late to start making sure that good candidates are running for these increasingly important positions.
Thank you. Thank you. The clock is ticking, so I'm going to turn it over to Therese to see what kinds of questions we have in the chat.
Well, thank you. We have, first of all, Joyce, enormous enthusiasm and appreciation for what you've been saying here today and also for what you write. I know you have a publicist who has a time limit on your time. When is it you
I actually have to go
Yes.
teach a class at the law school after this.
There you go. So maybe, I know we're just about out of your time. Is that right? Do you want to
We've
take
got
I think
enough.
we can do a couple of questions.
Okay, great. Well, I'll pick two or three that come in the chat. One is really asking, what do we do about the fact that we have lower courts? In lower courts, lawyers like Mark Elias are successful in challenging Trump's orders, but Trump ignores the orders. The cases get all the way, seem to be moving up towards the Supreme Court. What do we do? What do we expect from the Supreme Court? And what do we do if and when they hand him more victories?
Well, look, I think this narrative about Trump outrunning the courts is important. It's something to pay attention to. This is a Supreme Court that told the president he was immune from the threat of criminal prosecution. And in large part, that's why we're where we are today. The challenge that the Supreme Court now faces is whether it's going to continue to remain relevant, because the Trump administration has numerous cases either on the way to the court or in front of the court, where the basic legal proposition they're trying to get the court to accept is that the courts don't have the power to review decisions made by the president. I think at the margin, this Supreme Court does not want to cede all of its power and become irrelevant as an institution. So we will see them gild that lily in some ways and stand for the institution of judicial review of lower court decisions. That's not to say that I'm a big fan of the way that this court is conducting itself in this regard. It's been far too willing to expand the power of the presidency at the expense of other branches of government. And because I really do believe that everything goes back to voting, this is an important reason to return a Democratic majority in the Senate to block any expansion of not conservative, because these are not conservatives as I know and have loved to argue doctrine with them for all the years of my professional life. These are people on the uber right fringes who believe in upsetting the balance of power among branches of government at the far right on the court. But there seems to be the prospect of a 5-justice majority combining the center and the left that will stand to hold this president in check. We'll find out if that will happen in some of the cases in front of the court involving deportations and the National Guard. But something I want to focus your attention on is how magnificently federal district judges and federal courts of appeals have been. You know, these are brave people who the president has been not afraid to put bullseyes on their backs, right, to make targets out of federal judges. And they have nonetheless looked at the cases in front of them and have decided them fairly, as fairly to this administration as to the people challenging this administration's actions. I'm so remarkably impressed by these folks, and I think that they deserve our admiration and our support. And if you're of the postcard writing school and have been writing postcards to voters, you might want to think about writing postcards to one of these judges who's being attacked by MAGA and the far right in the press because of a decision. Just drop a note card to their chambers addresses. They all have addresses for the courts online these days, and tell them how much you appreciate their steadfastness and their adherence to the rule of law.
That is a superb suggestion right up our alley, Joyce. I'd like to just touch on something that's near and dear to so many of our hearts and to Linda's, because she's a former social studies teacher. But we think a great deal about how do we help young people register. We work a lot with the Civic Center, and we have a great many people who are retired educators themselves or have been involved in education because of our families. So we're thinking about education for democracy, civics education, which has gone by the wayside in so many places in these last few decades. And I realize we could all talk for another 2 hours about this, but we'd love to know, where do you see civic education? What, as you think about it, what are the top of mind reflections you have?
So I devote really most of the book to this question. It's really what the book is about. How do we redefine civics education? How do we do it well in the classroom, but take it out of the classroom as well? What can we learn from the experience of former communist countries coming out of communism into democracy? The short version of that is that democracy has to be experiential, right? We have to experience it in our lives as young people to see its value. And then thinking about what do we do to make democracy not just something that we take for granted because we can't afford to do that any longer, but how do we put it into practice? I have a chapter that writes extensively about an American holiday you may have never heard about. It's called Law Day. And Law Day, which has been around for decades, is one day a year where lawyers go into classrooms or have lunches with speakers, and we talk about the importance of the rule of law. And it's a great day. And the problem is, it's just that one day. We need to really start having Law Day every day. I think it's an opportunity for lawyers to work with educators and artists and politicians to make sure that we never take democracy again in this country for granted, which is one of the reasons that this administration has been successful in eroding it. It's because we don't think about it and keep it top of mind. So I hope that you'll pick up a copy of my book and read it and let me know what you think about that chapter. And if you do decide to take on Law Day as your own project or something similar, I hope you'll drop me a note and let me know what you're doing.
We will, and I think we will also write some postcards to judges. That is such an important thought. I know we're going to need to let you go, Joyce, but
Yes.
on behalf of all of us, thank you. We are going to be looking for your book. If we haven't already purchased it, we'll have that information in our follow-up emails. We'll have the recording shared of this part of our meeting shared with all of the folks who registered. So, Linda, would you want to thank Joyce?
I certainly do. I want to thank you for writing the book. I want to thank you for taking the time in a very busy time for you to be here with us. We appreciate it very much. And I know I plan to be giving copies of this book to some people as gifts. And I also heard you mention yesterday with Katie saying buying books to put in little libraries, which I thought was a great idea. So,
Apparently, my girlfriends have all been doing that. I can't take credit for it, but my friend in San Francisco and Berkeley had put them out in their neighborhood, and they were all gone by the next morning. So I hope that means people are reading and being inspired.
great.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we will let you go.
Thank y'all so much for having me. I love, this is kitchen table democracy, and I love that we all got to be a part of it together. So thank you for being with me.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, thanks.
We will see you tomorrow in your Substack.
I'll see y'all then. Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Goodbye, thank you.
Thank you.